Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. I am very excited to welcome Dr. Michael Zuckert to the show. He's a renowned scholar of political theory and American constitutionalism with decades of teaching experience at some of the country's top universities. Beyond the classroom, he's also shared his expertise with the public through radio and documentaries, and we are very excited to have him on the podcast. Dr. Zuckert, the question we have today is, how did the Constitution address slavery at the time of its founding?
Well, as you probably know, this is an extremely controversial question right now, and it's actually been very controversial for a long time. The controversy goes back to before the Civil War, and there were kind of two points of view that were very strong then, and they actually persist even now. One point of view, much associated with the abolitionists, held that the Constitution was extremely supportive of slavery, and therefore was, as the chief abolitionist said, a covenant with death. That is a very bad thing for all the help that it gave to slavery. The alternative position was taken by, well, there were a couple of alternative positions, but the one that carries on the controversy into today particularly was a position associated with Lincoln or other members of the Republican Party, which held that while the Constitution made some accommodations to slavery, it was not particularly, it was helpful, but that was not its main aim, and that the hope was the hope of the founders was that slavery would ultimately disappear. So that's a controversy, and it really persists into today. How much aid and comfort the Constitution gave to slavery, and what the motives were for the people who wrote the Constitution. So the abolitionists, on the one hand, held that slavery was supported in the Constitution because of greed. It was a big moneymaker, and secondly, by racism, the concerns that we recognize today. Whereas the party of Lincoln held more that the slavery received some accommodation in the Constitution, but the point of it was more it was a necessity in certain ways to deal with an institution that well pre-existed the existence of the U.S. as a nation, that came into existence with the Revolution. One of the things that there's a lot of controversy about is how many parts of the Constitution actually deal with slavery. And some of the neo-Garrisonians, as I call them, after the leading abolitionists, some of them say, 18 clauses or something like that. Whereas Lincoln, for example, would say, well, there are only 3 that are clearly identified with slavery. And I'm going to focus my attention on those 3, because otherwise we'd be here all night talking about the whole rest of it. So the 3, maybe they're familiar to you, but are these. First, the so-called 3/5 clause. This is a clause in the Constitution providing the rule for representation in Congress. So each state is to be represented according to its population, and that representation, or that population, I should say, is to be counted according to the formula that free people will count for 1 each, and enslaved people will count for 3/5 each. So as we get the phrase, the 3/5 clause. The second part of the Constitution that's clearly about slavery is the so-called slave trade clause. The slave trade clause holds that Congress will not have the power to prohibit or regulate the slave trade for 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution, which would take them to 1808. And in fact, when 1808 rolled around, Congress did indeed prohibit the slave trade further. But that is part of the Constitution. And then the third part is the so-called fugitive slave clause. This was an attempt by Congress to prevent what might otherwise legally be the case, that if a slave should escape from a slave state to a free state, that slave would become free, or that the state into which that he had fled would decree him free and protect him. And this was prevented by the fugitive slave clause. So these three, they sounds indeed supportive of slavery, and it indeed was. But I'd like to say a little bit more specifically to try to understand what these clauses were about and where they came from and what they really signify. Let me begin by a kind of speaking at a general level by calling attention to what's not in the Constitution about slavery. So one thing is, until the 13th Amendment, which was adopted after the Civil War, the words slave or slavery nowhere appeared in the Constitution. And this was not actually just an accident. This was by design. Let me quote you quickly a passage that James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, what James Madison said at the Constitutional Convention on this very issue. He said, "It is wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in men." So the omission of that word was really with some forethought, and it was meant to give the idea that slavery is something frowned on in this Constitution. So that's the first part. The second, and in a way more operational, if you look in the Constitution, there is no federal power given to deal with slavery in the states. The federal government, the government brought into existence by the Constitution, has no power to deal with slavery in the states. So those are two of the big things that were not in the Constitution that have some bearing on how the Constitution stands towards slavery. Then let's look at what is in the Constitution, and we'll look at the three clauses that I mentioned to you before. Let me read you part of the Fugitive Slave Clause. Remember the clause that prohibits free states from, in effect, freeing slaves who have escaped into them. The Fugitive Slave Clause says as following: persons held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. And then it goes on and says about not freeing those slaves. So again, let me repeat: persons held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. All right, that's the first clause. I'm going to come back and we'll talk about that in a second. I'd like to mention then the slave trade clause. Slave trade clause goes something like this. It refers to a power of Congress to not prohibit for those 20 years, quote, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Okay, it's referring people who, if the slaves want to import persons as slaves, that they have the right to do that for those 20 years. And then third, finally, the 3/5 clause, which is already mentioned, establishes a representation, whole person representation for free people, and 3/5 for the enslaved. Now, I don't know, there are two things that you might notice about all three of these clauses. First, the word slave nowhere appears. And in place of that, we have very almost weird workarounds, that is, very awkward circumlocutions which describe these people, but does not, in fact, use that term. Such persons as any of the states now existing, or in the Fugitive Slaves Clause, persons held to service or labor. So that's one thing, the way in which we don't mention this term, and we find alternative ways of describing them without describing them as slaves. And the second point to notice in all three of these clauses is the emphasis on the states as the source of the slavery that they experience. Held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. another in the slave trade clause, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. In other words, what the Constitution is saying is that slavery, so far as it exists in the United States, is not an institution of the federal government, that is, the government created by the Constitution, but rather is an institution of the states, which pre-exists the Constitution, and which it actually had no particular power to deal with. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. One way to understand what all of this is saying is I'm going to give you a quotation from Stephen Douglas. Perhaps you remember him. He's the guy that Abraham Lincoln debated up and down the state of Illinois. And Stephen Douglas, who was not nearly as anti-slavery as Lincoln was, but he said the following that I think captures pretty well what these clauses are trying to say. A slave within the meaning of the Constitution, says Douglas, is, quote, a person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, not under the Constitution of the United States, nor by the laws thereof, nor by virtue of any federal authority whatsoever, but under the laws of the particular state where such service or labor may be due. That is to say, Douglas points out clearly how slavery is an institution of the states and not an institution of the government created by the Constitution. So there's an interesting question. Why are these three places in the Constitution selected out for notice and some protection when everything else in the Constitution turns its back against slavery? I think the answer is, here's the answer I would give to that question. These are three places where, because of the structure of the new government, slavery necessarily somehow had to be treated. So let's take the issue of representation. We have a new system in which we're going to represent the population of the individual states. You may all remember that under the Articles of Confederation, the government which preceded the Constitution, each state had equal representation. Each state had one vote. This was considered wrong and was replaced with the idea that the states deserve representation in proportion to their size and their importance and so on. And so we're going to have population-based representation. Well, then the question came up, well, what about the slaves? And this was a question in a couple of different ways. One, because the slaves themselves, of course, didn't have a vote, so it's not exactly that they would be represented. It's the people who were holding them as slaves would have representation. And the more the slaves were counted as one equal persons, the more representation that actually gave, the more power that actually gave to the slaveholders. It didn't do anything for the slaves, well, other than make them more vulnerable. So, but this was a place where the Constitution had to make some decision about how to count the slaves. And the interesting thing about this is that the slaveholders, yes, they wanted to count the slaves as whole persons, for reasons that I just mentioned, that would increase their representation and their power in Congress. And the free states, the states which were in the process of abolishing slavery, favored counting them, in some cases, as zero persons, because the idea was this was not to support or increase the power of the slaveholders. Well, this issue was ultimately settled in the following way. Under the Articles of Confederation, there had been a provision that each state would contribute to the Treasury of the government, Treasury of the United States, this was during the Revolutionary War, would contribute during the war an amount of money based on their population, just the same kind of idea as we have with the 3/5 clause. And the idea was, well, let me back up, actually based on their wealth, on the state's wealth. And there was supposed to be a kind of census taken of the wealth of the state, and then they would be charged a certain amount of money based on their wealth. Well, can you imagine what it's like to tally up the total wealth of a state in the middle of a war? It would be difficult at any time, but not very difficult in the middle of a war. So they settled on a compromise, and that compromise was they would count population instead. So that's how we got the concern with population in the Articles of Confederation. And then the question came up again, well, should the slaves be counted towards this tally? And the slaves, as laborers, actually do contribute to the wealth of the states. And here we have the interesting case where the slaveholders wanted to say, well, wait, they contribute less because they do less work, or they are less productive than free workers would be, because people don't work so hard when they're not keeping the result of their labor themselves. So that's one answer. But the free states, on the other hand, said, no, we're going to count them more as contributing more to your wealth, so you'll have to contribute more. Well, so one answer was to say, we'll count the slaves as half. And another answer was to say, we'll count them as 2/3. And guess where the 3/5 formula came up? That is a compromise between 1/2 and 2/3. So that's the location of that one. The second clause that needed to be dealt with was the slave trade clause. The slave trade clause became important because the federal government, the new government, was given a power to regulate trade with foreign countries. And trade with foreign countries did involve the slave trade. That was part of the trade with foreign countries. And so, therefore, some policy or other would have to be arrived at to deal with that. Would the new government be allowed to abolish the slave trade? Would it be allowed to regulate it? Or not? And some of the states, in this case, Georgia, South Carolina in particular, these states said, we cannot do without the slave trade being open for at least some more years. They didn't specify how many. And they threatened to not join the Union if it was left possible for the Congress to outlaw the slave trade right away. And for various reasons, this threat mattered to the others, so they came to this compromise, I guess, that will keep the slave trade open for 10 years just for those states that want it. Other states that don't want it are allowed to forbid it for entry into their own states. But for those states that want it, we'll keep it open. But then after 10 years, the Congress has the power to forbid the slave trade, which, as I said before, they did. And then finally, we have the Fugitive Slave Clause, which over time became the most controversial of the three. And the Fugitive Slave Clause, we have to think back to how they were thinking about the Union. The Union was meant to be a very large free trade zone in which there would be open borders. That is, would be very possible to move from one state to the other. There wouldn't be guards at the border or anything like that. And so there'd be freedom of movement. Now, that freedom of movement would, however, facilitate escaping slaves. Now, that was a problem for the Union in the following way. It would be a standing source of friction and perhaps hostility between the states. And one of their concerns was that we not have that happen in the U.S., that we want the states to get along okay. So as a matter of comity, that is, of sort of good relations between the states, they put in the Fugitive Slave Clause to prohibit this source of friction, or to prevent this source of friction, which it actually in practice didn't do, but nonetheless it was there. And we can see the importance of the Fugitive Slave Clause, or why it's there better, when we look at where in the Constitution we find it. It's in Article 4. And Article 4 is the article that deals with relations between the states. That is, this isn't really a statement about slavery. It's a statement about interstate relations. And that was the main thing that determined that outcome. So where are we when we come down to a kind of estimate of what we might think about slavery? I'd say two things on that. One, the provisions about slavery that we find in the Constitution are not a result, really, of what they thought about slavery, what they aimed for, what they wanted to see for the future of slavery, but rather derived from the particular structure of the Union. And the particular structure of the Union was a federation. That is, we created a federation in which, on the one hand, we have individual states that are joined together for certain common purposes, but not for all purposes. And it was not understood to be the business of the central government of this federation to deal with the internal life of the states. That's one. And secondly, the individual states were understood to be republics, meaning self-governing entities. And that meant that the other states should not interfere much, anyway, with the internal governance of the states. So my main point would be the character of what they were trying to create led to the dominant fact about the Constitution, which is to say that slavery was accepted for those states that wanted to have it as a function of the federal character of the system that they were establishing. But on the other side, we see that slavery was understood to be somehow not a good thing, not a good thing. Their refusal, for example, to use the word slavery. If slavery were something they accepted or even relished, they would not have treated they would not have used all those awkward circumlocutions that they did. So that seems to me to suggest that in their minds, slavery was legal in the Constitution within certain boundaries, the limited boundaries I mentioned, but that it was not legitimate. It was not legitimate. And if we think about the broader political theory or political thought context or political culture context of the time, I think we can see that the principles of politics that they were working with largely worked against slavery. So, for example, as we all learned somewhere in high school or elementary school, the Declaration of Independence starts off, all men are created equal, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Slavery is simply completely incompatible with those principles. So that in the backdrop of American political life were certain principles which spoke against slavery, but in the foreground there were certain facts which at least made the survival of it in the present moment almost a necessity. So we went into the Constitution began with a conflict, an internal conflict between legitimacy and legality. That is, we had certain practices and institutions which were legal but not legitimate. And any political community which has such a conflict has a difficult time, how should we say, living with that tension. So there's always pressure for it to go one way or the other. And that's exactly what we saw in the pre-Civil War period, where there was an effort by the slaveholding states to make the Union more compatible with slavery altogether. People like John C. Calhoun said that the Declaration of Independence, when it says all men are created equal, is lying. This is a lie. This isn't true. On the other hand, the abolitionists wanted to say we need to get rid of slavery because it's incompatible with the principles of legitimacy. Well, the result of this was the Civil War, of course. And of course, the free states won the Civil War and produced for us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which undid slavery as a fact in America, tried to establish the civil rights of the freedmen, and finally tried to establish in the 15th Amendment the political rights for the freedmen. Now, it's a long story, but these amendments didn't exactly transform the nation entirely, so we're still living with some of the legacy of the pre-existing slavery. But that's the story of how the Constitution dealt with slavery, kind of in a brief form, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zuckert. I have so many pages worth of notes, and I appreciate that you talked about what is in the Constitution, but also having us look at what is not in the Constitution, because I think that both of those considerations are, are important, as well as the words that are used, right? Not using the word
Mhm.
slavery means something.
Correct.
Thank you so much. Your expertise is just unmatched. And I really appreciate you giving our listeners such a great story that tells us, how the founders addressed slavery in the Constitution. We appreciate you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.